What is the difference between interpreter and compiler? When we write code, we usually write it in a high-level language. But as we know, computer only understands machine code, or zeros and ones. So how do computer actually reads our instruction given in a high-level language? Well, here comes the savior, compiler or interpreter. At a very high level, they both do the same thing. They convert our high-level programming language into machine code. But the main difference is the way they do that. The compiler takes the entire code you have written in a high-level language and then converts it into machine code. But on the other hand, the interpreter takes instruction line by line and converts them into machine code. As interpreter converts your code line by line, for that reason, interpreted language is comparatively slower than compiled language. So now you may say that compiled language is better than an interpreted language. But that's not true. They have their own pros and cons. Before jumping to the pros and cons, first of all, let's quickly see the difference between interpreted language and compiled language. Compiler scans the entire of your code at once. But on the other hand, interpreter translates only one line of a program at a time. The compiler takes a lot of time to analyze the source code, but the overall time to execute the program is much faster. But an interpreter takes less time to analyze the source code, but the overall time to execute the program is slower than compiled language. A compiler generates an intermediate object code, hence it consumes more memory. But an interpreter does not generate an intermediary code, hence it is highly memory efficient. A compiler generates the error message only after it analyzes the entire code, hence debugging is relatively harder while working with a compiler. But an interpreter keeps translating the program until it confirms the first error. If any error occurs, it will stop working, hence debugging becomes easier. Compilers are used by programming languages like C, C++, Objective-C, and many others. And interpreters are used by programming languages like Java, PHP, and a lot others. Now let's see some of the pros and cons of using compiled language and interpreted language. First of all, let's talk about what is the pros and cons of using compiled language. So once your code is compiled, it's always ready to run. So basically when you compile your code, it's basically becomes an exe file, so that means you can run it anytime you want. So another pros of using compiled language is that you can optimize the code according to any CPU, so it's run often faster on that particular CPU. So another pros of using compiled language is that your source code is always private. So you don't have to worry about that your source code could be stolen or something like that. So if you are looking for that your source code should be private, then you obviously should go for compiled language. But that's not all about compiled language. We have also cons of compiled language. So quickly let's look at them. Compiled languages are not cross-platform. So if you're writing a program for a particular platform, you won't be able to run that program in another platform. For example, if you're writing a program for Windows, that particular program you can't run on Mac or on Linux. Compiled languages are not flexible. So what do I mean by that? So if you written a program for a specific CPU and for example you have written a program for Windows and for a particular CPU, even if you are in a Windows platform and if you change the CPU, your program is not gonna run. So that's a really big problem that you have to optimize your code for various CPU. And another cons of using compiled language that you need to take an extra step if you want to test your code. So basically if you have written a code, you have to first of all compile that code and then you will be able to test your code. So this is the extra step you have to take, and if your program is really big program you have written and it could take a hell lot of time to analyze the code and to compile that code. So it could be really big problem while testing your program. So that was the pros and cons of using compiled language. Now let's move on to the pros and cons of interpreted language. So first of all, the pros of interpreted language is interpreted languages are usually cross-platform. So that means you can run your program written for particular platform on other platform. So if you have written a program for Windows in an interpreted language, you also will be able to run the same program without any change on other platforms like Mac or Linux. And secondly, interpreted languages are simpler to test. So as interpreter reads your code line by line, so it doesn't convert your entire of your code at once. So it's analyze your code faster, so you don't have to wait a lot of time to test your code. You just write your code and run your code, that's it, and interpreter takes care of everything. And as interpreter converts your code line by line, so it's easier to debug. So what do I mean by that? Suppose you have an error, on line number 17, but still your code will be run till 16 line. And once you find the error, it will show you that error message, and you can fix it easily that you have an error in line number 17. But interpreted languages also have their own cons. So now let's talk about them. So first cons you will face about interpreted language is you will always need an interpreter to run any program written in an interpreted language. So if you written a program in an interpreted language, you always need an interpreter to run that particular program. Interpreted languages are slower than compiled language. So as interpreter reads your code line by line, so it's obvious that it will be slower than compiled language. And the third thing is your source code is always public. So as interpreter does not convert your code into machine code, so instead of that, your interpreted language simply shared a copy of that same code, so your source code is always public. Now as they both have their pros and cons, there is a third way of doing this, and that's called the intermediate approach. That's basically is a mixture of compiler and interpreter. In this approach, instead of converting entire of your code into machine code, it converts your code into bytecode. And then you share your code with others, and when other people run your code, it converts your bytecode into machine code. And this process often referred to as JIT compilation or just-in-time compilation. Languages like Java, C#, Python uses this approach. So the conclusion is, if you want faster runtime, then you should go for compiled languages. And if you are looking for cross-platform functionality, then you should go for interpreted language. Or you can go for intermediate language as well if you want kind of both. So thank you so much guys. Thanks for watching this video. Take care. Bye bye. Tata.